Hi there. Today's lesson will be over indirect object pronouns in Spanish, and we're going to go back and start with a verb that we've already used where we actually already learned indirect object pronouns, and that verb is gustar. In English, we think of this as to like I like the book, I like the store. It actually means to be pleasing to, and to is the word that we want to focus on. It is pleasing to someone. To or for whom is it pleasing? So we have the book. It is pleasing to me, may, and that may goes before the conjugated verb of gusta, and that is your indirect object pronoun. An indirect object is to or for whom an action occurs. In this case, we can see the action is occurring for me. Who is the book pleasing for or to? It's pleasing to me. So you've actually already learned the indirect object pronouns. In order to identify the indirect object in a sentence, simply ask yourself, to or for whom is the action occurring? The action is our verb. We're going to replace the indirect object with an indirect object pronoun. A pronoun replaces a noun, like we previously learned with subject pronouns. Instead of saying, for Pablo, Pablo walks to the store, Pablo buys a soda, Pablo walks home, I replace Pablo with he. So we've already learned pronouns, and now we're learning a new type of pronoun called an indirect object pronoun. Let's start with an easy sentence in English. I washed the car, that's supposed to be one R, for Pablo. To or for whom is the car being washed? It's being washed for Pablo. We can replace that and say it is being washed for him. Let's take a look at indirect and direct object pronouns. Now today the lesson is only over indirect object pronouns, but I do want to talk a bit about direct object pronouns because they are similar and because we often use them together. You'll learn more about direct object pronouns in the next chapter, and then you'll also learn about how to use them together in the same sentence. So it may seem very similar to you. An indirect object is to or for whom an action occurs, and the direct object receives the action. So what's the difference here? Think about direct receives the action first, right? And to or for whom is secondary to receiving that action. So let's look at a simple sentence. I washed the car for Pablo again. We identify my verb. What is receiving the action of being washed? The car. So that is my direct object. And then to or for whom is the car being washed? Is it being washed for the car? No, it's being washed for Pablo. So for Pablo is my indirect object, or Pablo is my indirect object. So I wash, it can be replaced with a pronoun. The car can be replaced with the pronoun it. And for Pablo can be replaced with the indirect object pronoun him. So we have two different types of pronouns, the indirect object pronouns and the direct object pronouns. And those both replace direct objects and indirect objects. And notice objects are nouns. Pronouns replace nouns. So this makes our speech much more simpler when we're just saying I wash it for him instead of sounding very strange and saying I washed the car for Pablo. I waxed the car for Pablo. It would sound kind of weird if we kept repeating those objects in our sentence. But again, today we're only learning about indirect object pronouns. I just wanted to give you a forward glance at the direct objects to see how those are going to come into play later. Let's take a look at an easy sentence and see if we can identify our indirect object, replace it with an indirect object pronoun, and then rewrite our sentence. There are 4 steps that you want to follow if you want to break this down. The first step is to identify the verb. Go ahead and look at your sentence. You can include the subject pronoun yo if you'd like to, but that's implied because we have our O on the end showing us that is the yo form. And we know that lavo is my verb. Now, next I want to identify my indirect object. Now that I know my verb, I can ask the question to or for whom is that action, the verb, occurring? Another way to identify the indirect object is to look for two key words, a and para. In this case, we have the word para, for, and a will mean to, that you'll see in other sentences. It's very easy to identify who our indirect object pronoun is in the sentence because it says directly para Pablo. Okay, so now we've identified that Pablo is my indirect object. Step 3 is to replace my indirect object with the indirect object pronoun. We know that Pablo is my indirect object, so which indirect object pronoun at the right chart would make sense to replace Pablo with? I wash the car for me, I wash the car for you, informal, or I wash the car for him. Lay would make the most sense. That would be the appropriate answer. We're going to replace Pablo with lay, and I just like to cross it out, and sometimes I put an arrow and put my word underneath it, lay. That's my indirect object pronoun. Step 4 is going to be to reorder the entire sentence. Now we're not answering a question and we're not conjugating verbs. We are simply rewriting the same sentence, replacing the indirect object with the indirect object pronoun. Let's take a look at the order in which this is going to occur, or our grammar structure. Let's go back to look at me gusta el libro like we've learned before. And as we noted before, it's kind of backwards. It says the book is pleasing to me. So the indirect object pronoun, the person to or for whom the action occurs, is at the beginning of the sentence, right? To me, it pleases the book. Sounds a little bit weird. And then the conjugated verb. So to me, it pleases the book. So keep in mind that the order structure is going to be different than in English in this case when we're using the pronoun to replace the indirect object. So there are 4 steps to replace the indirect object with the indirect object pronoun. One of those grammar structures at the end is to put the indirect object pronoun and then your conjugated verb. It's very important to note that you need to have a conjugated verb because later we're going to talk about infinitive verbs and gerunds. Okay, let's talk about certain verbs that are more commonly used with indirect objects. I think it's pretty simple to see why. Let's look. Contar is to tell to or for someone, to answer to someone, to give to someone, to write to someone, to shout at someone, to speak to someone, and so on. So you can see that these are to a person or for a person. And again, those words to will be identified with a, and for in your sentence you will see para. Let's take a look at another sentence in Spanish. Yo cuento un secreto a Lisa. Let's identify my verb, cuento. To or for whom am I telling the secret? Lisa. Step 3, replace my indirect object with an indirect object pronoun. Which of the indirect object pronouns would replace Lisa? I tell a story to me, I tell a story to you, I tell a story to her, lay. What's step 4? What do you need to do next? 4 is to reorder the sentence. We just talked about the grammatical structure. It's the indirect object pronoun first, and then my conjugated verb, just like I did with gusta, where it was me gusta. Indirect object pronoun, then my conjugated verb. So here we have yo, le for Lisa, cuento un secreto. All right, does my verb change? No, I'm not answering a question. I'm not changing a verb. I'm not conjugating anything here. We're simply rewriting the sentence to replace Lisa with her. So if we translate this, it says, I to her, I tell a story. Sounds kind of funny to us, but again, it's a foreign language. We have to be flexible in our thinking and know that it's just going to be different than in English. Yo le cuento un secreto. Indirect object, pronoun, then my conjugated verb. Let's take another look at another sentence. Santa da una muñeca a Sally. Same thing, identify my verb, da. Step 2, identify my indirect object, which I find by asking to or for whom was the gift given. To Sally, I can also identify that by finding the a or the para, usually. So we know that Sally is my indirect object. Step 3, let's replace my indirect object with a pronoun. Santa gave the doll to me, to you, to her, to us, to them, y'all. Which one is it? Lay. Again, it's lay. Step 4, reorder my sentence. Don't conjugate the verb. We're not answering a question. We're leaving the sentence the same. We're only replacing Sally. Santa. Indirect object pronoun should come next. We're replacing Sally. Then my conjugated verb, una muñeca. Okay, let's talk for a second though. I just crossed out Sally. However, it is acceptable to leave in Sally even though we have replaced her. It's okay to say Santa le da una muñeca a Sally. And does that sound redundant to you? It sounds redundant to me. Let's listen to it. Santa gives a doll to Sally. Santa to her gives a doll to Sally. So we're saying to her and to Sally, specifying the person twice that's to or for whom the action is occurring. This is okay because we're either clarifying or we're emphasizing to or for whom the action occurred. For example, I might have been talking about Joe and said he received a gun, and but she received a doll, Sally, and emphasizing the difference between the two, or specifying that it wasn't Joe, it was Sally that got the doll. Also, maybe I haven't introduced Sally into the story yet, and I need to specify who Lay is because Lay refers to 3 different people, as does Les. So oftentimes you'll see the indirect object repeated at the end or at the beginning of the sentence. You've seen this before with like a mí me gusta, a ti te gusta. It was also used there, and that is completely acceptable to use the indirect object and the indirect object pronoun in the same sentence. Just a little caveat here though, we do not repeat the direct object. Later on when we're learning direct objects, we do not repeat the direct object when we've replaced the direct object with a pronoun. However, we can repeat the indirect object even though we've replaced it with an indirect object pronoun for clarification or for emphasis. Let's talk about another sentence here. Tú escribes una carta a tu madre. Escribes is my verb. Be careful here because oftentimes I'll see students put a ti, or they'll replace it with te because they see tu madre. So let's look again at this. A tu madre, to or for whom is the letter being written. It's a tu madre, so it's not to you, it's to your mother, which would be replaced with which pronoun? Your mother would be replaced in English with to her. Okay, so the letter is the direct object, is being written to or for your mother, for her. Okay, let's rewrite that sentence. To, indirect object pronoun should go here, ley, then my conjugated verb, escribes una carta. Can we repeat a tu madre? Yes, for clarification or emphasis, it is actually still correct to repeat it, even though we've already replaced it with an indirect object pronoun. So you, to her, you write a letter to your mother. Again, be careful not to put te, like tu te escribes, you write the letter to yourself. That is not what the end of the sentence says. It says to your mother using that possessive adjective, so be very careful. Okay, let's take a look at this time. We're going to change it into an infinitive structure. So it says vas a escribir. You are going to write a letter to your mother. We have the ir plus a plus infinitive structure here. So you can see that this whole thing is a verb structure, verb clause. We have an indirect object pronoun plus a conjugated verb format that we can use, but we also can do a conjugated verb. And let's change the color here. My infinitive with the indirect object pronoun tagged onto the actual infinitive. Remember, an infinitive verb is the words that end with AR, ER, IR, and these all become one word with the indirect object pronoun tagged onto the end. In this case, we have a verb structure with ir plus a, so let's make sure we still include the a. Tu vas a escribir, and lay was still to your mother, right? That we did in the previous example. We've just tagged on the indirect object pronoun onto the infinitive there. Don't forget, we can also write it before the conjugated verb. That's also correct. Still here, we always have a conjugated verb in a sentence. However, we don't always have an infinitive, so you can write it either way here. Tu lay, indirect object pronoun, vas, conjugated verb, a escribir. Don't forget the rest of your verb clause there. The vas a escribir all stays together. And last but not least, we're going to talk about the third structure that you can end up with, which is a conjugated verb plus a gerund with the indirect object pronoun tagged onto the end. You might be asking, what's a gerund again? These are the verbs that end with ando, yendo, and yendo. For example, estoy escribiendo, I am writing. In this case, we've already identified our indirect object pronoun, so if we follow the grammar structure, yo estoy escribiendo una carta a tu madre can be rewritten as either one, an indirect object pronoun plus a conjugated verb. Remember that your verb is the whole verb clause, in this case, estoy escribiendo. So those two words have to stay together. Verb clauses will never be broken up. You'll never put something in the middle of those two verbs. So we can either follow grammar structure number one with an indirect object pronoun at the beginning, like we've been doing in our previous examples. Le estoy, that's my conjugated verb estoy, so it's still coming before my conjugated verb, but don't forget the rest of your verb clause, escribiendo. Or we can use this new structure, the third one, with a conjugated verb plus a gerund plus an indirect object pronoun. Yo estoy escribiéndole, and because we've added an accent, a syllable to that, we have to add an accent mark. And you can look up and see all the grammar rules following accent marks. It's very complicated, believe it or not. So yo estoy escribiéndole. Just keep in mind when you're adding a syllable on these in particular, you're adding the le to the end of it, creates another syllable. You're probably going to have an accent mark on there. So thank you for watching. Hope this helps.